Chapter 5 Canoe for Four. Not being a people which depends upon the river for its living, the savants have not even the elementary notions common to fishing tribes. To them as hunters, a stream of water represents an appropriate setting for the building of huts on its banks, and serves to supply the vital liquid which their necessities require, or it is simply an obstacle. They will never identify the flow of a river as a means of locomotion, for they are ignorant of how to build canoes, and are essentially wanderers on foot. The only watercraft they possessed dated from an earlier journey of the Salesian, who had left it behind as he found it impossible to tow it back upriver with the feeble motor of his large canoe. I had never stopped to think about this pirogue. Now, as I looked at it from the high overhanging bank, a tingling sensation invaded my whole body. It was some 12.5 feet long and about 2 feet wide, which gave it a stability that could only be called perilous, and its stern rose too high out of the water. I had the impression that the canoe shared my sensations, for as I looked, a small piece of wood carried along by the current barely grazed it as it passed, and the canoe's reply was a long shudder as if of agony. Here was my problem, then, and it had come to light the evening before at the tribal council with the arrival of a warrior from the parent village. I had been invited to the council, and I sat on a deerskin spread upon the ground. I was considerably excited since, for the first time, I was present at a tribal meeting, and was about to see a member of the most famous warrior tribe in Brazil. The Indian who spoke, standing in the center of the circle, was a medium stature, although his physique had the toughness characteristic of his race. As a distinctive adornment, he wore a necklace of small beads in 2 strands, at the end of which were tied 3 deer hoofs, and with red and black feathers. As a trusty warrior of high rank, he was permitted to retain his spear. My eager expectation was shared by all those of the council. A visitor was quite an event, for it was a means of conveying messages, tales, information concerning hunting, and talk of peace and war. This savant discoursed in a whisper, gesticulating with his free hand. When his audience interrupted him, they did so unceremoniously, but on the whole they remained silent or made clicking noises with their tongues as a sign of incredulity or surprise. The warrior from the parent village was consulted by the chief about my prospective journey. He scrutinized me for a moment, and then rapidly uttered a reply. Oki vouchsafed to interpret it to me. The parent tribe was at present in the hunting grounds of the river some days' march away. That was all. When the visiting warrior sat down, the council deliberated for a while, but of what they were saying I understood nothing. Oki once more enlightened me. As a great favor to me, the chief had enlisted the assistance of 2 warriors, one named Yurita, a nephew of the captain, and another named Fabre. I thanked them all for the confidence they showed in us, and for the collaboration of the warriors. But when I left the council, I was inwardly consumed with uneasiness. We should need at least 6 warriors to transport our paraphernalia through the jungle. That night, in my sleeping net, the idea of the canoe took shape. Indeed, it had to, because only by water would we be enabled to reach the parent village, with so few natives to carry the equipment. Fabre and Ureta sat on some boulders by the river bank, and very earnestly watched what I was doing. As I worked on the canoe, the strong smell of uricum reached me. They were gleaming with the red paint and garish adornments with which they had bedecked their persons. Their long hair had been neatly combed, and their belts, necklaces, and the strings by which their ornaments were tied were all brand new. At the last moment I found that the canoe had a hole in the stern, and I was mending it. I stuck on a board from a packing case with wild rubber and then nailed it. I trimmed some branches and laid them like struts on which to rest the cargo so that it would not get wet, and I managed to fix in 2 new seats which I made with the help of the missionaries. To perform these simple operations I had to be a skillful equilibrist, for the canoe swayed and wobbled as though it were afflicted with St. Vitus' dance. I could not secure it firmly on the sand. Its bottom was terribly split and cracked in long, deep grooves, which, as soon as the water got into them, would presumably open up irreparably. I did not care to think what would happen once it was laden, and with all of us on board. I calculated that any idea of a voyage in this canoe ought to be rejected out of hand as a foolhardy act of temerity. But then many things were foolhardy. It was foolhardy to be among a tribe of savages who despised the white man, to undertake this trip with 2 warriors whom we did not know, and who might abandon us or kill us, to make straight for a village which had always rejected civilized man, but we were becoming accustomed to the idea that what was a dangerous was merely natural, and under a blazing sun and in an infernal temperature, I went on stowing away the boxes and bags containing our material. As I had expected, the devilish canoe gave me many headaches before we got under way. Not less than 5 times I changed the cargo, to the delight of the whole village, which was looking on. After a great expenditure of energy on my part, all was ready, everything, that is to say, that was absolutely indispensable, for half of our baggage had to remain behind in the missionary's cabin. As my shirt and trousers were sticking to my body with perspiration, I decided to bathe with them on, to try to keep cool, and to avoid as far as possible being pestered by troublesome tiny flies. At this the hereto suppressed smiles of the tribe became broader, until women, children, and men burst into noisy laughter. As though released, they dropped their aloof politeness and came near. A little later, the river once more returned to normal, and the women and children were bathing and drawing water. It was midday, a bad time to set off, when the Indians took the places I assigned to them and pushed with the oars. My wife finished bidding an affectionate farewell to the Indian women, who were her special friends, and we had said goodbye to the amiable missionaries. I assured the 2 warriors that their precious ball of Uricum, their new arrows with their gaudy leathers, as well as the palmitos, young palm shoots they had brought with them, were not in danger of falling into the river. Then I sat down in the stern, and shoving with the oar, maneuvered the craft away from the bank. I bade a final and effusive farewell to the missionaries, received their blessing, and we moved out into the stream on what was destined to be a voyage of continual anxieties. The relatives of the Indians who were accompanying us gave vent to piercing cries in ritual lament. I had supposed that the savants would have some rudimentary knowledge of the use of oars. It was not so. They had no conception of the careful and measured thrust required to keep the canoe under control, or any sense of balance. They gave 1 or 2 healthy shoves with the oars, which soaked us, caused the craft to sway perilously, and made our prow collide with an overhanging bush on the steep river bank. The cries from the shore were redoubled, and 2 or 3 Indians plunged into the water to come to our assistance, backing water energetically with the stern oar so as to counteract the current. which was thrusting us crosswise, performing contortions to offset the abrupt movements of the two warriors. I yelled frantically to the savants who were swimming towards us not to touch the canoe, or they would overturn us. Fortunately, they understood me. My wife took Sabre's oar from him, and with her resolute collaboration, we managed to back and straighten out. The rapid current immediately swept us onward. I took the helm and waited until we had the craft under control, and until I had got the feel of the river's impetus, before I ventured to teach the Indians the tricky handling of oars, navigating an unsuitable and overloaded canoe. They wanted to learn. The near tragedy had robbed them of their proverbial serenity. Amid warning shouts, faulty strokes, and with the glowering certainty of sinking, we continued our journey with tense nerves, ready to be plunged into the water at any moment. We advanced painfully, borne along by the current. The Indians' oars were useless, while my own served only to keep us going in a not very straight line. I guided the canoe as close as possible to the bank in anticipation of capsizing, and kept one eye open for half-submerged tree trunks and the other on our course. The prow passed within inches of long branches that whipped the surface of the water or swayed menacingly, ready at the slightest relaxation of our vigil to rob us of any projecting cargo or to cause injury to some member of the crew. The seat which I occupied as steersman was in the extreme end of the stern. It was about a foot wide, and I was very uncomfortable. The board on which I sat tilted back towards the stern, so that I had continually to move with the utmost delicacy to avoid slipping and unbalancing the canoe. I gripped the oar in one hand, making a lever of it against my waist, and with the blade held against the current, and when I got the chance, I quickly took up a handful of water with the other hand and poured it on to the seat, so that my trousers would stick to the board. This gave me only a brief respite. The warriors did not appreciate what the dramatic consequences of capsizing would be. To them it simply meant a soaking. To us it would mean the end of all our hopes. Ureta, the more influential of the two, sat in front of me. Then came the cargo, my wife, and in the prow Fabre. The latter had a way of making me so mad, he would give one or two thrusts with the oar and then stop to arrange his hair, his adornments, or his bundle of arrows, which caused the craft to sway perilously. I decided not to intervene, assuming that his common sense would warn him how crazy his behavior was. I was wrong. As the hours went by, his actions became ever more senseless. In addition, he was markedly lazy, and he glanced at me disdainfully. A herd of young wild pigs were nibbling the tender lush grass on the riverbank. At the sight of the animals, the hunter's instincts were aroused in Fabre, and he seized his bow. I shouted to him to put it down, telling him that we had meat enough and to spare, and that his movements would overturn us. For a second he contemplated me with mocking scorn, and started to get to his feet. With a savage thrust of my oar, I caused the canoe to change course abruptly, and made the warrior fall back, as he had no effective means of support. The arrow escaped from his flexed bow and flew upwards. When he sat down again, the herd of wild hogs was behind us. His face bore an expression of profound annoyance. I did not wait for him to react. I ordered him to row. As he was reluctant to do so, Ureta repeated the order. The warrior complied. Although he had his back to me, I guessed that Ureta was censuring the attitude of his fellow tribesmen. Amid shakings and rattlings, we pulled into the shore to have lunch. The smell of the Indians' uricum instantly attracted the blood-sucking mosquitoes. We paid no attention to them, however, as we sought relief from the suffocating heat in the cool water of the river and got ready to have our meal. Cold rice and smoked wild hog flesh, followed by raspadura. The Indians had not bathed. They sat on their haunches and waited for Norma to serve them too. When she did so, they invited us to share the wild palmitos. The flavor and freshness of the palmitos, recently cut, were excellent and effectively compensated for our lack of fruit. Meanwhile, Sabre's sullenness was wearing off. They ate the food using their fingers and never relaxed their attentiveness. Any slight sound, even one that was inaudible to my own ears, would cause them to stop chewing. When they heard a sound among the upper branches of a tree, each of the warriors, in a fraction of a second, had his bow loaded with an arrow and was ready to shoot. A marmoset paid us a visit. It was just a ball of golden yellow fluff with a little black bead-like eyes, which seemed to be rolling around incessantly. It uttered sharp, shrill cries and vanished. No sooner had they finished eating than the Indians took a bath. The heat was overpowering. To cool ourselves we were continually throwing water over our heads, necks, or our whole bodies, but a few moments later we were as dry as ever. The glare of the sun on the water was intense. If one looked towards the next bend in the river, one's vision seemed blurred by the haze that hovered over the banks. We were making some headway now. My wife's body and my own reacted as if it were instinctively to the slightest swaying of the canoe, and had by now become thoroughly accustomed to every movement of the boat. The savants were not so frequently making the abrupt movements they made at first. Their oars were not splashing us, and they were going in and out of the water with a certain rhythm, but still without real power. When I made signs to them to put more effort into their strokes, they indicated the current to me, implying with consummate eloquence that there was no point in wasting their energies so long as the river itself was impelling us along. I did not know whether to laugh or show indignation. I chose to do the former, for I had problems enough without adding another. Besides their lack of enthusiasm, there was something else that tired my patience as a civilized man. Every sound, the cry of a bird, the splash of a fish, the rustle of a tree branch, arrested their attention. It caused them to stop rowing, and they listened until whatever was alerting them died away, or until they discovered what it was. Norma chatted to me and cheered me up with her infectious gaiety. I should have liked to share her optimism, but I reckoned that if I did so we might soon find ourselves all floundering in the river. I had expected many things from that canoe trip. Above all, it had seemed that it would provide an ideal environment in which to study the savants who accompanied us, but the only study I managed to make was learning how to keep a canoe afloat, with two members of the crew aboard who seemed obstinately bent on sinking it. The borders of the River of the Dead were consistently luxuriant in vegetation, white emaciated tree trunks pushing their leafy tops into the tangled mass of jungle foliage. Creepers smothered with yellow and pink blossoms, and lianas that frustrated all the attempts of lesser plants to seek the sun's rays. Here and there a clump of lofty palm trees rose on the far horizon. My wife and I gazed at them. The warriors smiled with their eyes as they exclaimed, "Sabud, look," and pointed to the source of the coveted palmito. Snatches of silence mingled with the now familiar sounds, the in-and-out movement of the oars, the lashing of the lower branches of the trees as the river washed against them, the sudden flight of some wading bird, the cries with which the waterfowl greeted us from the banks without troubling to budge, the leaping of a fish, the call of some animal hidden among undergrowth. The coast followed the innumerable curves of the river, revealing on the high overhanging banks the marks, still damp, left by the recent sudden receding of the waters. Every now and then we brushed against extensive reed beds. At other times we almost ran aground upon sand banks, whose dazzling fringes delighted our hearts. One beach alluringly invited us to camp there, but it was too early. We did not come across another, and at last we had to content ourselves with pulling in beside a steep bank where there was still some sun. We tied the canoe to some strong roots and removed what was absolutely necessary from the craft: a tarpaulin, some bed covers, the hammocks, and some food. After washing, we stretched our numbed muscles. The savants gathered firewood reluctantly. They regarded this as woman's work. Then they went fishing with some lines that we lent them. I was so exhausted that I had no enthusiasm for study and gave myself up to the rest. I forgot all about the warriors, and lying down on part of the equipment we had brought from the canoe, I closed my eyes and was soon asleep. I woke with a start. The Indians were shouting in chorus. My hand leapt to my revolver, which I always carried in my belt. When Norma's serenity calmed me, the fuss was occasioned by the fact that for the third time a school of black piranhas had carried away part of the fishing line, which was made of steel cable and the fish hooks. However, 7 gasping piranhas lay dying at the Indians' feet. Climbing the steep river bank, loaded with equipment, was quite a feat, considering myself to blame for not having accepted that welcoming beach. I set myself the penance of cutting steps with a machete. So much energy was I obliged to expend upon this task that I had little left for clearing the ground where we were to camp for the night and for fixing the hammocks. By common agreement, we cleared a square patch of small shrubs, brambles, and tall grass. We sprayed everywhere with DDT and laid out the hammocks to serve as mattresses. We stretched the tarpaulin overhead, tying it to 4 branches driven into the ground, and thus we soon had a passable lodging in which to spend the night. To guard against jaguars and the serpent called suracucu, about 12 feet long and with a deadly bite, we spread dry branches all around, with the approval and collaboration of the Indians, so that we should be able to hear the suspicious sounds of any predatory approach. This snake, by the way, is a creature of extraordinary malevolence. It has allotted itself an extensive domain from which it never strays, but woe betide any creature that ventures into it. The reptile wastes no time in lying in ambush, but rushes forth to fight whatever it is that may have enraged it, whether a human being, a jaguar, a stag, or even a fire caused by the heat and the excessively dry weather. In camp fires of Sertaneros, we have camped in the jungle and later returned to make use of the same site. Have been found that frizzled remains of these great ophidians sometimes still gripping a dead firebrand in their powerful jaws. The warriors disappeared into the jungle. Their natural modesty led them to retire to attend to their necessities. The bedding was aired in the warmth of the declining sun, and shortly afterwards the undisputed king of the Mato Grosso retired swathed in a mantle of red clouds and slowly descended from a sky diffused with pale pink as a sign that he would re-emerge in all his flaming glory the following day. We heated our supper over the fire, and the fish were strung up on green branches by the Indians and roasted. The dancing flames dispelled the gloom of night, and soon the stars began to glitter, and our camp became a radiant center of glowing warmth. Norma supervised the cooking of our meal. The savants came back with great branches of palm leaves, which they called etchu, and made a covering mat with them. The rushing of the river could be heard vaguely in the distance. No other natural sound was to be heard. No bird or animal disturbed the incredible peace of the night. Only the crackling of our fire and the rattling of a saucepan lid as the contents simmered. Now at last I was really able to observe the Indians at my leisure. Rest had quickened my senses. The contentment I felt called for a pipe. I filled the bowl slowly as if to make the most of those precious moments. I had brought very little tobacco, and it was only to be used for special occasions, and this was one of them. The Indians dispatched the fish with relish, as well as the leftovers from the midday meal of wild pig. We ate with them and gave them rice, beans, and raspadura, as they would not accept the chocolate we offered them. We made ready for the night. We stirred the fire, and the Indians lay down with their feet towards it, covering themselves with the palm leaf mats. Our space was very confused, and they had to lie beside me. As I got into my sleeping bag, I felt thankful that on that first day we had not encountered any rapid or rocky stretch, either of which almost assuredly would have sunk us. My wife fell asleep at once. It was only a moment or so after I had closed my eyes when I felt something warm touching my neck. Stirring as little as possible, I freed one hand from the blankets, and groping for the machete, I picked up my flashlight and switched it on. It was Eurita's forearm. I nudged him. He reacted instantly. He was not even fully awake when his hand gripped the spear that he had stuck into the ground beside his head. At first I thought it was another of Eurita's limbs that had roused me. The fire gave no light. It was a heap of glowing embers. The savant was sitting up and had his spear firmly in his grasp. He murmured "Au jus," which made me grab my carbine and remove the safety catch in case I had to fire. I awakened Norma. A jaguar was prowling around our encampment. My wife, without a word, gripped her shotgun too. We pricked up our ears. We clearly heard a hoarse, dry cough at ground level. Then nothing. We all remained on alert for some time, our weapons at the ready, when we were quite certain that the jaguar had gone away. We made up the dying fire and warmed ourselves before lying down again. The Indians polished off a fish that had been left over. Dawn broke in biting, freezing cold as usual. A thick white mist hung over the river, and the night dew still covered everything. The sun had not yet pierced the denseness of the forest. The Indians were warming themselves at the fire. Water was pouring off their muscular bodies. They had had a bath to counteract the low temperature. No sooner did they notice that we were awake than they adopted their habitual squatting position and observed us closely. Although our provisions were at hand, they had not touched anything, yet they must have been hungry, for the savant belongs to a tribe that is well acquainted with hunger and is therefore always ready to eat. When my wife greeted them, they replied with a shy nod. The cold and indifferent exterior they had exhibited was beginning to thaw. It seemed that the journey, the fishing, the shared meals, and the incident with the jaguar had bound them a little more closely to us. Generally speaking, I am a serious-faced person. Now, with the savants at my side, I had to dispense smiles more plentifully. Whenever I smiled and spoke, almost in a whisper, they readily responded, without looking at me, but if I overlooked these unaccustomed niceties, they would not answer and fix their eyes in a grave and sullen stare on whatever I was doing, ready at once to resist whatever had given rise to my attitude, for they never expressed themselves in a loud voice, unless it was an immediate prelude to aggression. After breakfast, we gathered up the utensils and equipment and broke camp. Before we put on our clothes, we dried them by the fire, but when we reached the foot of the high river bank, our clothing was soaking wet because of the dew on the undergrowth. At the sight of the frail canoe, I experienced an odd sensation that made me shudder. Very rarely in my life have I felt similar apprehension. It was as if, on purpose, we were courting utter disaster. I shrugged away the thought and set to work to stow away the bags and boxes. We had to wade up to the knees and get into the craft. The earth on the river banks was slimy and treacherous. To bring the canoe right up to the bank itself was impossible, because we had all to be inside it and keep it in a safe state of equilibrium with the oars. A jaguar certainly had visited us in the night. Its tracks were imprinted in the mud, and the marks of its feet were stamped all over the tarpaulin that covered the stuff in the canoe. Apparently it had sniffed the contents in search of the source of the tempting smell of wild pig. Just as in the middle of the day we had longed for some shade to shelter us a little from the intense sun, so now we found ourselves praying for the sun to come out and drive away the dank mist. A cold breeze blew strongly against our prow, and I was obliged to pull harder on the oars. Some blood blisters which had come up on my hands burst and caused me pain. To crown it all, neither Fabre nor Ureta was helping. We were making scarcely any headway. The effect of the current hardly offset the resistance of the wind. I suddenly had a bright idea suggested by the pride of these warriors. I told them that my own strength was greater than theirs combined, and challenged them, if they did not believe it, to try to beat me at the oars. For the first time they actually laughed. I warned Norma to redouble her attention, and getting ready to lean towards the opposite side to that on which they were rowing, I urged them jeeringly to take me on. The canoe gave a groan, and with all the weight suddenly pitched aft, it leapt forward with a shudder at the mighty pull of the warriors. A shower of water sprayed us. They rowed badly, but we gathered speed. For each shove of the Indians' oars, I gave 2 short, well-controlled thrusts, regulating with the tiller while they had their oars in the air. In this way, I managed to keep the canoe on a more or less straight course. I have always been attracted to rowing, and consider myself a fairly good oarsman, but as the minutes passed, I became aware of the unflagging determination of the savants to beat me. In spite of my subterfuge of steering with my oar, I felt myself weakening. Ureta gave an order, and both he and Fabre ceased rowing. I took advantage of this lull to back up with my oar and make the canoe veer towards their side so as to give the appearance of having won. The warrior turned round and asked hopefully, "Uba perdi?" "Uba perdi," I agreed, puffing and blowing, meaning, "Yes, you're right, the boat is very heavy." I imagined I had found a way to make them row with a will, but I was wrong. They treated the thing as a game, which they had no inclination to play any more. However, they did row fairly willingly after that. It is true that they stopped at the slightest provocation, but they recognized that the white man also could go ahead if he set his mind to it, and that, after all, was a triumph. The sun cut through the mist and broke it up into isolated patches. Out of one of those little islands of mist rose the heads of a pair of tapirs, swimming away to reach the bank. With their trunks uplifted and their piggy eyes fixed on the place they were making for, they seemed unconcerned about us. We passed within 15 feet of them. This time the instinct of responsibility guided the warriors. Neither of them made any move towards his bow and arrows. I took the risk of going in a straight line when we came to bends in the river's course, so as to save time. Our companions were inexpert, and their oars still splashed us somewhat, but their efforts now imparted some lasting speed to the canoe, and consequently more stability. Tiny ticks were making a meal of me, though not of my wife, and they were producing a smarting irritation that was maddening. This added to the heat, the mosquitoes which now accompanied us in clouds, and the constant strain of taking care we did not overturn made the voyage unremitting torture. I had to put up with the itching. I had no hands to defend myself with, and as for the mosquitoes, I left them alone until there was a swarm of them upon my wrist or ankles, and then squashed them with one sudden swipe. I estimated that it was noon. My watch was in the knapsack, not only because it was a nuisance on account of the sweat that poured down my arms, but because it was obviously an essential in the jungle. We were looking for a shady place and a flat, shrubless bank to moor at, when the sound I heard froze my blood. The canoe gained speed, and it was with great effort that I managed to heave to at the riverside. The place was most inhospitable. Thorny brambles and branches pricked and scratched our flesh or struck us on the head. It was impossible to land. Fabre and I clung desperately to the roots, and despite our effort, the canoe put into the bank and pulled out again according to the fluctuations of the current. We had before us the first rapid of the trip. That dull, thunderous roar, and all that it signified, was anything but pleasant. And using my right hand and holding on with my left, I cut away the most troublesome branches with the machete, and we managed to moor the unstable craft. I tested the water for depth. It came up to my chest. Wallowing about in the mud, we opened a breach in the jungle. Here the savants were in their element. In a moment or so we reached the tree zone, where shrubs and creepers no longer impeded our progress. The The plan was simple but tiring. The cargo was to be left on the shore for the time being, and later the Indians would carry it to the canoe when once the latter had negotiated the rapid. Norma was to wait behind with the equipment. I tied long ropes to the banks, and each of us grasping one. We entered the water and held on grimly whenever occasion arose. Luckily, the place we had stopped happened to be the deepest part. The savant's intelligence proved a decisive factor. They understood the instructions and complied with them, while two of us held the canoe firm, clutching at roots, branches, or boulders. The other went forward, and if he was overbalanced by the current, the rope that he was holding supported him. He tied the rope or made it fast, and then we slowly loosened it until we could see that the craft was steady. Thus, laboriously, yard by yard, we won from the rapid our right of way. We eluded the roaring center of the rushing cataract and entered calm waters, which seemed like a dream to me. Exhausted, we rested a while on the bank. With our machetes, we opened a way through the jungle, which turned out to be easier than I had expected, and we returned together with my wife and the cargo along that strangely welcoming path. By common consent, we decided to call it a day. We needed meat, and beside the fine sand of the narrow stretch of beach was exactly what we had been hoping to find on which to make camp. As the days passed, and we covered the scores of miles of that lazy river of the dead, things were going better. Ureta and Saure were no longer two strangers. They were loyal friends whom we could trust. We respected one another. At sundown, when we camped for the night, they would go off on a short expedition. They always brought something back for the common pot: tender, tasty birds as big as turkeys, called variously jacu, mutu, and yakutinga, and young wild pigs or fishes of some kind.